Let me see. There we go. All right. Hi. Happy Friday, everybody. This will be a real quick little video talking about France in the Middle Ages. We have covered everything that I want you guys to know about England. And so this is the information that I want you to understand about medieval France. So, both of these kingdoms and the kingdoms that we'll talk about next week, like the Holy Roman Empire and Spain, they really solidify themselves and come together as kingdoms and powerhouses at the end of the medieval era, which is why it's important to remember like these particular stories that I am presenting to you, is because it creates, an understanding of, okay, how did they go from being, just kind of these smaller territories with these minor lords to like France, with these really major kings, and England, with these really, major history altering kings and queens. And, like I said, these are the stories that get you there. So, 987 AD, the last Carolingian king is going to die in the West Frankish Empire. So the Carolingian kings, of course, are, the heirs from Charlemagne. Well, the Frankish nobles in the West are actually going to elect a man named Hugh Capet to be their king. And this Capetian dynasty is going to last, for a good while in France until you have, in French, the Bourbon dynasty, but you can just call them the Bourbon dynasty. The main Capetian king of note that I want you to remember is Philip II Augustus, and he is going to reign from 1180 to 1223. And the reason why he's really the only one I want you to remember is because he's the only one that acquires more land for France and gets its boundary lines, closer to the France that, we see today on the map. So he acquires the areas of Normandy, Maine, Anjou, and Aquitaine, which are, again, like they're all on the map there except Maine. And no, not the state of Maine in the United States, Maine in France. And so, again, like he's kind of the one I want you to remember the most because he increases their boundaries. So I told you guys yesterday about Parliament in England, and this is a direct result, of course, of the Magna Carta that was signed in 1215. But of course, France hears about England creating this Parliament, and they're all like, well, ooh, we need to have something like that. So they create what's called the Estates General of France. And yeah, it meets for the first time, in 1302. But the long and the short of the Estates General is that it does nothing. In France, the Estates General can only be called upon to meet by the king. Well, French kings are pretty well known for not really listening to anybody but themselves. So the Estates General very rarely is going to meet throughout history. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to come back into play again, and that you shouldn't keep the fact that that does exist tucked back in the back of your brain, because we will talk about the Estates General, and it will play a part in France's history in units to come. But an estate, as it says on the slide there, is just simply a social or political class. The first estate was the clergy, the second, the nobles, and then the third, the townspeople and the peasants. So basically like everybody else. And like I said, the Estates General is going to very, very rarely meet, but don't forget about them. Okay, so France is this up-and-coming new monarchy, like England, like Spain, during the end of the Middle Ages. Louis XI is going to be a Bourbon king, so we've switched families. And he is going to be the guy that takes the crown more towards that like absolute monarchy stage, which is actually the next unit. The next unit, we're going to be talking about the kings of Europe that had total and complete power and believed that they were the kings that God appointed, and very, very absolute in their rule. And so Louis XI is again a huge culprit as to how that happens in France, because he creates the taille, which is a land tax that funnels directly to the crown. And so all of this land tax that he instills, all that money, again, goes right into the budget for the royal family. And he also turns around and limits the power of his own nobility. But while he's doing that, he's very smart. He turns around and is very capitalistic and promotes a lot of industry and a lot of commerce and is very economically progressive. So he's well liked because everybody's making money. But at the same time, he's taking power away from the nobles and funneling more money to his own crown. So pretty smart dude. And again, sets up the dynasty for, of course, all the Louis to come, the most famous being Louis XIV, the Sun King, who builds the Palace of Versailles. And we'll talk about him a good bit again in units to come. So you can't talk about England and talk about France in the Middle Ages without talking about the 100 Years' War. I mean, this is essentially what creates one of the biggest rivalries in all of world history, which is that of the English and the French. And we can thank that rivalry for our own independence. So thank you, 100 Years' War. But so what happens is the French, as they're trying to expand their new, up and coming kingdom and territory, they go and they take over land that is originally owned and operated by the English. And I think that actually that is a huge misconception amongst students a lot of times, is y'all have England always in your brain as only England that we see today, the Isle, the island. That's actually not true. You have to remember, I taught you guys on, Monday or Tuesday, I can't really remember at this point, that William of Normandy, comes in and has the big Norman conquest in 1066 at the Battle of Hastings. Guys, the court of England, the King of England, lived in what we consider to be northern France for a very long time, for centuries, actually. The English court for centuries didn't speak English, they spoke French. And so, what we actually think of as English doesn't really solidify until after the 100 Years' War, which is part of what makes it such an important war to understand. But they start fighting, and it's called the 100 Years' War because it literally lasts almost 100 years. And I'm going to kind of skip past Joan of Arc. I'll get back to her in just a second and go to this timeline. So I want you to look at the timeline. You've got 1337, and France is orange, England is green. 1360, 1429, and then behind my head that you can't see the date is 1453. So in 1429, if you look at the map, who is clearly winning based on the timeline? Well, England. England has obviously taken large amounts of land back from France and looks like they're going to win. Looks like they're doing pretty good. So why in the world come 1453 did they lose? Well, it's because of the War of the Roses. They had gotten so distracted by their own infighting due to the House of Lancaster and House of York duking it out all the time, that they lost the 100 Years' War to the French. And so this is why England does not have any land anymore in what we consider northern France. They lost it all in the 100 Years' War. This is also the reason why the English court stops speaking French and commits to only speaking English. And it really kind of solidifies their identities as staunchly English and staunchly French. And then, of course, that rivalry deepens and becomes really kind of a defining part of not just European history, but world history. And it really all is due to the 100 Years' War and how that ended and just the ripple effects that then that created for both cultures and both countries' sense of nationalism. I mean, you have to admit, part of France's nationalism and part of England's nationalism is in their shared history of hatred towards each other. So anyway, so that's a big part of why I teach you guys about the 100 Years' War. At the end of the 100 Years' War, for the most part, this kind of marks the end of the Middle Ages for both England and France. And then they go into what becomes known as the early modern period. But that's it as far as what I kind of want you to understand about the 100 Years' War. Now, the most famous story that comes out of the 100 Years' War is that of Joan of Arc. So she is actually the patron saint of France now. So she's kind of an important girl to know about. So her story it sounds like fiction, but that's how history is sometimes. The truth sounds more outlandish than fiction. But she is a 16-year-old girl who says, who an angel comes and tells her that she needs to go and talk to the Dauphin of France, which is the king, and tell him that she needs to lead the army because that's how they're going to defeat the English, is if she is leading them. So she makes her way. She's just a 16-year-old peasant girl, and she makes her way to the courts, gets an audience with the king, and tells him, well, I feel like only the king of France would be like, okay, why not? And so he believes her, gives her an army, and sends her off to go fight to see what happens. And so one of her first big tests in battle is to retake the city of Orleans, which had been taken and sieged by the English. And she wins. She gets it back. And of course, her fame then just like skyrockets throughout France. I mean, the 16-year-old girl, she's leading the army. She has now taken back the city of Orleans in France's name, and she very much becomes like a symbol of French pride during the 100 Years' War. Well, the English, of course, want to find her and capture her as quickly as possible, because you want to talk about a huge slap in the face. They're getting beat by a 16-year-old girl. And so they send out like this specific group of English knights, essentially, to go try and find her and capture her. And they do. And unfortunately, when they do, she is, she's put through like a mockery of a trial. But I mean, they knew what they were going to do with her the second that they captured her. And she is burned at the stake. So that is unfortunately the tragic end of Joan of Arc, but her historical legacy very much has lived on. I always like to tell students when I teach about Joan of Arc, like, y'all are about 16. What have you done lately of note? So, not that I want you to go lead an army against people, but, pretty impressive track record for a 16-year-old peasant girl in France in the 15th century. This video is about her. It's just a real short, less than 3-minute little synopsis about Joan of Arc. And that is it for today. I hope you guys have an awesome weekend. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you Monday. Bye.